We three kings of Israel are Saul, David, and Solomon. That is the three kings of Israel proper. When you have Israel and Judah all together, there were three kings that ruled over that kingdom, and it was Saul, David, and Solomon. There are some very interesting things among all three of them, but we're going to take a look at their lives, what events led to them being king, and a little bit about their character, the different things that happened as they went. Let's get started. In 1 Samuel is where we read a lot and where we're going to stay for the most part as far as these kings are concerned. There's a theme that's going to keep coming up. It'll keep coming back, and it's to do trusting. So you do what it is that God wants you to do, trusting Him for the results of whatever is going to happen. Especially if we know that God has called us to something, and we can get into that a little bit more later, but you do whatever it is that He's called you to do, and you just trust Him for the results. Maybe it's not going to look like you want it to look. There's going to be hardships along the way. However, we still do it, and we trust God as we go. Now, where did all of this happen? As we said before, it happened in Israel. This was at the end of the time of the judges, pretty much. You had Samuel, who the book is obviously named after. He was really the last of the judges of Israel. And he had set his sons up to be judges over Israel as well. In his mind, it was going to be the succession of him being judge over Israel. Israel didn't like these sons, and they had good reason not to. His sons were corrupt. They didn't follow in his ways. They took bribes. They perverted justice. Israel didn't care for that too much, so they asked for a king. Before we get too harsh on Israel for asking for a king, because this was not a good thing that they asked for. God was not pleased by it by any means. But before we judge them too much, let's take a look at what happened before and the last time that they had a couple of sons of someone who weren't doing things that were too good. Back in 1 Samuel chapter 2, you have this priest called Eli. Now, Eli and his sons, they had this habit of taking the fat from the meat that was brought in, or really taking the fat from the animals that were brought in to be sacrificed. This was not supposed to happen. Okay, so that wasn't supposed to happen. People make mistakes. Yeah, they're priests, they're serving God, but even that can kind of be overlooked. However much Eli might have done that, his sons did it even more so. And it even says in 1 Samuel chapter 2, it says his sons did not know the Lord. So it wasn't so much, or it wasn't just enough that his sons were taking fat from the animals. They didn't even know the Lord. In chapter 2, verse 12, it says, "Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. The custom of the priest with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest servant would come while the meat was boiling with a three-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot or whatever that is. All that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. This is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Moreover, before the fat was burned, the fat was supposed to be burned off, burned away. Remember, these sacrifices were not just for food. This was symbolic of, really, ultimately, it was symbolic of Christ and His sacrifice, but it was symbolic of God removing the sin from Israel, transferring the sin onto the animal and removing it. But they would take the fat. And before the fat was burned, the priest servant would come out and say to the man who was sacrificing, 'Give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw.' So they wanted raw meat. And the man said, 'Let them burn the fat first, then take as much as you wish.' See, the raw meat was also not supposed to be eaten, right? And he would say, 'No, you must give it now. If not, I'll take it by force.' So that's what they did. So the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt." Again, they did not know God. They're ministering to the Lord, supposedly, and they didn't even know God. So That's a problem, for sure. We find out if we go down to verse 22, we see that Eli was very old, and he kept hearing all that his sons were doing to all Israel, how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance of the tent of meeting. So the fat from the meat was not enough. They did more. And he said to them, "Why do you do such things? I hear of your evil dealings from all these people." "No, my sons, it's no good report that I hear, the people of the Lord spreading abroad. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him?" But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was what the Lord desired to put them to death because of their sin. They also would not listen to the voice of their father because they didn't even know the Lord. So they didn't care if they were sinning against the Lord. It didn't mean anything to them. So the Lord ultimately rejects Eli and Eli's entire household. In verse 29 of chapter 2, he says, "Why then do you scorn my sacrifice and my offerings that I commanded for my dwelling, and honor your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choicest parts of every offering of my people Israel?" So this is where we get the part that Eli also was fattening himself. God rejects Eli. He says, "Look, you and your corrupt sons are not going to be priests." Who does he set up as a priest instead? He sets up Samuel as a priest instead. Now Samuel, he came from Elkanah. And Elkanah had two wives. Whenever you hear of more than one wife in the scriptures, there's nothing good that comes out of it. It doesn't say, and he had more than one wife, and everything was happy, and everything was wonderful. If anything is mentioned about multiple wives, there's always something bad that comes out of it. And this was no different. In this case, Elkanah had Peninnah, his wife, or Peninnah, and then she had several children. But then he also had Hannah. Now, he loved Hannah, but she couldn't have any kids. And Peninnah, she would rub it in Hannah's face and talk about her and mock her and about her not having any kids. So Hannah goes to the same temple that Eli is at in Shiloh, and she starts praying to God. She's entreating God to let me have a child. If you let me have a child, I will lend him to you, basically saying he's going to be yours. He's going to serve you. Eli sees it, says, "You're drunk, go home," because she's not actually talking. She's just kind of mouthing the words as she's praying in her head. She tells him what's going on, and Eli says, "God hears your prayer. May what you say be done." And he sends her home. So even despite Eli's sin, despite him not dealing with the sin of his sons, if nothing else, if his sons wouldn't change, he should have removed them from their post and not kept them where they were. Despite all of that, God still uses him. That should be encouraging to us. God still uses him despite all of his sin. That'll be a recurring theme here as well. At any rate, God does grant Hannah's prayer. Hannah has a child, names him Samuel. She brings Samuel after he's weaned. She brings him to the temple, to Eli, and then Eli more or less takes over as far as raising the child is concerned. Hannah goes back and sees him every year. They sacrifice the sacrifices every year. They go back and see him, and she keeps up at least a little bit of that relationship. But Samuel is being raised by Eli, and God calls Samuel out specifically to be a judge over Israel. So Eli's sons were corrupt. That's bad enough as far as the things in Shiloh that they were doing and the corruption that was going on there. Samuel is a sigh of relief for the Israelites. He comes in and he actually does things well, and he's a good judge for the Israelites. But he sets his sons up, and his sons don't follow in his ways either. They pervert justice. They take bribes. And so Israel says, that's enough. We've had enough. We had to deal with a generation, a lifetime of Eli's sons being corrupt, and now we got to have another set of sons being corrupt. And they didn't want anymore. They said, let me have a king. So I can get that. I understand that. However, the fact is, God is the King of Kings. God is the Judge of judges. And that's where we need to let our hope lie as well. That's where Israel should have let their hope lie. And they didn't. So God said, all right, that's not going to work out for you too well. He gives them a few warnings. If we look in Samuel chapter 8, 1 Samuel chapter 8, we'll start in verse 11 here. Because God tells Samuel, yep, give them what they want. Give them a king. That's what they want. They can have it. But here's what's going to happen. He says, you can have your king, but these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands, commanders of 50s, some to plow his ground, some to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. So he's going to draft your children into his army and into his service. That's not unique to kings. That's any government, especially the less they know God, the more they're probably going to tend to do these things. They're going to act like God. So he's going to do those things to your children. We move on to verse 14, and we see he will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. We have something kind of like that in the States here. It's called eminent domain. The government says, oh, no, all the land everywhere is ours. We'll pay you for it, but as long as we pay you for it, you really don't have the option to not sell it to us. You can't keep it because we can come in and we have eminent domain. That's not biblical, but that's what happens. We can see the same thing in government now. So he'll take the best of your vineyards, your olive orchards, basically the best of your land. He's going to take it. Verses 15. I'll do 15 and 17. We'll get back to verse 16. But he will take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take the tenth of your flocks, and you will be his slaves, his servants. Okay, so he's going to take taxes from you, and you're going to work to pay those taxes. You're going to be servants. You will be indentured to him, right? We know what taxes are like, and we know what it's like to have to work in order to pay those taxes. That's what we do. When we work, part of our work is to pay for the taxes that are assessed to us. And these taxes, understand, we're above the temple tithe. So when it says he'll take a tenth, this is not the tenth that they were giving to the temple. This is above and beyond that already. In verses 16 and 17, he will take your male servants, your female servants, the best of your young men, your donkeys, and put them to his work. End of verse 17, you will be his slaves. And then in 18, in that day you'll cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. You're going to serve him, is what he's saying. You will be servants of him. Now, we don't see that necessarily where we are, not that much anymore anyway. But when the king is corrupt, the people are oppressed. And the same can go for any kind of a dictatorship as well. When they are corrupt, the people are oppressed and the people cry out. Now, in this case, Israel has asked for it. And Israel knows now what they're getting into. God has told them clearly what they're getting into. He's giving them this one last chance. You can get out of it. This is what's going to happen if you choose a king for yourself. They say we want a king. Not only do we want a king, but we want a king like all the other nations have a king. I'm sure they're looking to the other nations and saying, look, they have someone to judge them. They have someone to go out and fight their battles for them. It's so much better what they've got than what we've got with these corrupt judges, with these corrupt priests that we had to deal with. But ultimately, only God is a good king. Only God is a good king. God would judge those judges. It might not be on the same timetable that we think of when God judges our leaders, but God will judge our leaders, and we need to leave that up to him ultimately. So this is what came about. And then we see in verse 19, after he says all of these warnings to them, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, no, but there will be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. So He told the Lord, and the Lord said, obey their voice and make them a king. So Samuel sends everybody off to their cities, and he comes to the Lord, and he asks, basically, he asked the Lord. The Lord said, I'll give them a king. You want a king? I'm going to give you a king. And then we see Saul enter the picture. So all of these events, all these things were happening. All of it led into Saul becoming king. And we'll take a look at that next time. We'll take a little more in-depth look at that and see what were the circumstances of him becoming king. Why was he chosen? How did he react to it? There'll be some interesting things coming out about that. Thanks.